Hi, I'm Kelly Tait. We're going to be covering nonverbal communication in Module 3. For this particular module, we're going to talk about these different things. We want you to be able to discuss various nonverbal channels and what is communicated through them, then to explain the impact of nonverbal communication on the perception of procedural fairness, and we want you to consider some examples of nonverbal communication that promote those four aspects of procedural fairness: voice, respect, understanding, and neutrality. Now, nonverbal communication is actually a really broad category. It covers a lot more than most people think. Really, what it means is everything that communicates except the words. And that is a really broad area. We're talking about even the way you say the words. So eye contact, gestures, posture, all those different things would be considered nonverbal communication. And a huge amount of information is transmitted through these channels. One of the things that we've found from research over many decades now is that more than half of the meaning of a message comes through those nonverbal channels. So if there's both verbal message, the words, and nonverbal, more than half is coming through the nonverbal channels. Actually, the estimates tend to be anywhere from 65% to 93%, so a huge amount. And in addition, you can actually change what you're saying, or the way what you're saying is interpreted, by your nonverbal communication. So we'll look more at that as well. A few things about nonverbal messages: you really can't avoid them. Even if you don't do something, you can have that behavior could be interpreted. So even if you don't show up somewhere, or you don't say something, somebody asks something and you just are silent, that is going to be interpreted as well. So you really can't avoid nonverbal messages. If there's almost always going to be nonverbal communication. So if you have both verbal and nonverbal communication, people will put more significance, more weight on the nonverbal communication. So if what you're saying doesn't match what you're doing or how you're saying it, then people will definitely be thinking how you're saying it is more indicative of what you really think. And of course, that's something like sarcasm. You can be saying one thing, but almost turn the meaning over by your tone of voice. Of course, that also opens up a pretty broad area for misinterpretation as well. So obviously, we don't promote that. Really, what we should be doing is trying to have every channel, every path that communication is coming through, say the same thing, because then it's by far more has more impact, and people remember it more, and of course, believe it more. The other thing about nonverbal messages is that a lot of what it communicates is related to emotions, attitudes, relationships, kind of who has the power in a particular interaction, particular context. So a whole bunch of the information about how the person, say somebody's speaking, how they feel about what they're saying, about the person they're saying it to, those kinds of things, about how they see the relationship with that person. Lots of that is coming through the nonverbal channels. We're also just not as good at interpreting nonverbal messages as we think. We are kind of the way our brains work. We're made to look for those things. We're very social creatures. We really focus in on social cues. However, there's so many differences, individual differences as well as cultural differences in terms of what people, how people use the nonverbal communication. And so that can make it very difficult to interpret. We're way better at interpreting nonverbal communication with people we know. So you might, like with coworkers, you would have a better idea of what certain behaviors mean. However, if you're just seeing someone in the courtroom briefly at the window, it's going to be one of those things where you really don't know exactly what they're saying through their nonverbals, and we often leap to conclusions about what things mean without even knowing we're doing it. It's really what we, kind of how we think, what we think normal is, or what feels right to us. And we really don't want to forget how many differences there are, both individual, cultural, any group that people belong to. It may have a pretty big impact on their nonverbal communication. These are some of the channels. There's a whole bunch of channels or paths that the communication comes through in the nonverbal area. So this would include voice, vocal cues. We'll look more at some of these: eye contact, gestures, facial expressions, bodily orientation and movement, and I think bodily orientation is one of those areas that term is not really familiar outside of the communication field. That's really how your body is oriented in relationship to the person you're interacting with. So do you turn toward them? Do you lean toward them, lean back? Those kinds of things. Appearance is another thing that falls under nonverbal communication. And it's one that people will make, obviously, snap judgments. And this is on both sides. We're talking about both you and the people that you're working with, the people you're dealing with. So they're making judgments based on your appearance, and you are too. And many times these are going on under the radar. So we're not conscious that we're making these leaps about what we think certain things mean, certain ways people dress, and that kind of thing. Sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes not. Some other channels, timeliness, do you start on time? How much time do different people get to speak to you? Those types of things. How much of the time they're listening, how much they're speaking. So it is another form of nonverbal communication. And then really almost any of the senses could be considered nonverbal communication in terms of touch, smell, those kinds of things. Even if there's not a lot of that in the judicial branch context, there still is going to be some, like touch, because there's not much. If there is any, somebody touches your arm, you see someone touch someone else, we put quite a bit of weight on that as well. Now I want to focus in on the channel of the voice a little bit more, the vocal cues that we have. And as we said, how you're saying something or even not saying something can add to the meaning of what you're saying or can actually change it. And in this area, there's some pretty good research on those different vocal characteristics that people tune into. One of them, of course, would be, or a couple, would be volume and enunciation. And these are pretty basic, obviously, but if you can't hear or can't understand what somebody's saying, then all the rest of it, right, the words, the inflections, those kinds of things aren't really going to be helpful. You have to have that as a foundation, and making sure that foundation is met first. Some other vocal characteristics that tend to impact people, pace and rhythm. So pace, how fast you speak. Many times when we're saying something that we've said a lot before, that we've, it's a common thing that we have to say, we often move through it very quickly. And the issue with that, of course, is for someone who's heard it a lot, maybe it wouldn't be a problem being able to catch on and keep up with a fairly quick pace. But for most of the people who are coming into the courthouse, into the courtroom, this is not something that they're used to, and there's so much different going on. They have a lot of emotions taking place too that make it a little bit harder to focus. So if you speak really quickly, then you might lose them. In addition, if you've said it a lot of times, we tend to have a rhythm that you can actually hear that it's memorized, as opposed to feeling like somebody's really talking to you. So you might have and have over and over kind of the same rhythm that doesn't add a lot of meaning to what you're saying, and it makes it very clear that you're just saying it. So for the person on the other end of that, it's how many times have they said this? How important does it actually seem? I think a good example of this is I've seen many court officers, some excellent ones who do it very well, and some who just race through swearing in. And so do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? You're going to lose someone, and it doesn't feel important. It's almost like a throwaway if you say it that fast and like it doesn't have extra meaning, like it's just something you have to get out of your mouth. So I think you really need to pay attention to the voice. This is a huge channel for everyone. It has a really big impact, and making sure you're saying something so that you give it the weight that it deserves is a good thing. Another big area is pitch and inflection. And with your voice, pitch is really how high or how low your voice is. And we all have a natural range that we're kind of comfortable in. But where lots of the meaning comes through is in the inflections, which is the change in pitch. So more of the ups and downs. And it's really kind of amazing how many things come through the inflections and how that can change the meaning. So we'll do a couple little exercises in just a minute having to do with that. Something in addition in terms of the voice and vocal cues are things like pauses, fillers, uhs, ums, likes, like those kind of things, things that come in when people are trying to think and are nervous, which you're often going to be seeing people who are nervous in the court context. And also then just silence. And with this, you have to really be aware of how many differences there are in terms of people, of different groups people are part of, different cultures. Thinking, of course, of culture in a very broad aspect. So even people in the rural areas versus urban areas might have a very different pace, for instance, might have longer pauses. People from other countries, a lot of, for instance, Asian countries, a lot of Native Americans here have pretty big differences in how long they pause. If they've been asked a question, how long they pause, are they letting it sink in or not? In our general U.S. culture, we are very fast-paced, and so we tend to move quickly, and if somebody pauses too long, we think they don't have something to say, or we might think there's something else negative. They don't know, they don't have anything to say, they're making something up. Our interpretations of long pauses and silence is a lot more negative than many cultures. Many cultures, the silence or a longer pause is a sign of respect, and a sign that they're really considering what was asked and really making sure that what they say is correct. But because we're moving so quickly, sometimes we don't even allow them to speak up when they have something to say, or we've done that kind of subconscious negative leap to what that means, or what that might mean, that they're taking longer than what we're used to. So playing with the voice a little bit, here's one exercise, and I'm hoping you're going to do this with me at home. We're going to have you say hey out loud, say the word hey 3 different times. All you're going to be doing is say hey to mean these 3 different things. So you should say hey to mean that's not fair. Hey, hey, right? The second one, say hey to mean watch out. Hey. So you can see the change in volume, the change in the way I say it, the little bit of differences in the way I use my voice changes the meaning. Now try this one. Say hey to mean my, you're attractive. Hey, right? So huge differences in that one little 3 letters. We can make it mean many different things. There's lots more than this. We can actually change the meaning based on how we say it. Now, most people who are, certainly if you're the general U.S. culture, those differences we're usually going to pick up. We do have to remember that people who are in the court context are going to be a little more intimidated, perhaps very emotional, nervous, those kinds of things. So they're not always going to pick up on every cue, but understand how much can come through the voice. Another exercise that I think is kind of fun is to look at just a sentence and see how differently it sounds and what meanings are sent based on what word you emphasize with your voice. So if you have the sentence, I didn't say he stole the money. If you emphasize different words in that, you change the meaning. I didn't say he stole the money. I didn't say he stole the money. I didn't say he stole the money. I didn't say he stole the money, right? So we've just shifted with our voices what we're really saying. And that's how powerful our voices are. So you really need, this is one of the channels to really tune into. Now I know I showed you a whole bunch of different nonverbal channels, and we're going to look at a few more, but I don't want you to feel like you have to pay attention all the time to every one of those channels: gesture, body orientation, voice, eye contact, right? All those different things. It's hard to tune into all of those at once and still do the rest of your job. However, I think it's really worthwhile to tune in to each of these channels at some point, to actively say, you know, for this next hour, I'm going to really monitor my voice and, you know, what I'm communicating with and what I'm getting from other people from their voices as well. The next nonverbal channel we're going to look at is eye contact. And this is a big one in our society, in particular our culture. Eye contact is generally perceived to indicate attention, respect. You might be seeing people's attitudes based on their eye contact, things like that. Now, I do understand that with your jobs, there are some major challenges to keeping a lot of eye contact. What I'm going to say is make sure you use eye contact at those key points. that there are certain times where when you look up, it has more power. It shows that you're listening, that you're acknowledging someone as an individual, right? Treating them with respect. So even if you're not looking up all the time, there's some things you can do to make sure people don't put some kind of negative interpretation on a little bit less eye contact. We do tend to use eye contact for things like monitoring what's happening, right? You look up and you see regulating interaction just by looking at someone. They might know if it's their turn or if you think they're going a little too long or what it might be. Again, major cultural differences in the meanings assigned to eye contact. There are many cultures and subcultures in the United States, cultures within cultures here, where less eye contact is considered respectful when it's with an authority figure. So as long as you know that, then if somebody's not looking at you as much as you'd want, and remember, it's going to feel a little awkward if someone's not doing it in the way that you're used to, but you need to be really careful not to put a negative interpretation on it, because there could be many reasons that they have less eye contact, one of them being that they're actually showing more respect for you. You as the authority figure, though, you certainly can have eye contact. You don't need to avoid eye contact because of those cultural differences. It's people who are at consider the person in authority at a higher level that would be careful of the eye contact. It is, I think, particularly difficult, but particularly important for busy authority figures like yourself to make sure that you do keep enough eye contact and look up when you say somebody's name, look up at moments when you are addressing someone. I've seen sentencing hearings where the judge never looked up, and I thought, I think it's hard. I think that would be a hard job to have to do, so I don't envy you that. But I also think it's part of your job to look up and really make some kind of contact with the person you're talking to and making sure you can tell, do they seem to be getting it? Are they paying attention? Are your words and your nonverbals having an impact? Another channel that we're going to talk about in terms of nonverbal communication is facial expressions. And facial expressions we do tend to think is tied pretty closely to communicating emotions. It might reflect mental processes if you're thinking, right, and you pull your eyebrows together if you're like me. There are some things that are in common across cultures that are basic to humans, to the way we're built. And that is expressions, the facial expressions of basic emotions. Anger, fear, surprise, disgust, happiness, those types of things. There's some of those that we're kind of hardwired to respond in a certain way. But there are huge cultural differences about how much of that is appropriate or who you should be showing those emotions to. So you have some cultures that would suppress public display of emotion. Right? So some things common across humans, but also some pretty big differences. The other thing I think with facial expressions to remember is that what you're thinking of as a neutral expression, you want to be the neutral decision maker, impartial, what you're thinking of as neutral may not be coming across that way to others. It is one of those things that as we get older, as I've gotten older, I do tend to pull in my brows when I'm thinking, right? So I now have a permanent line right here. And I have to work a little bit to make sure that I'm not just scrunching my face, I'm just concentrating. My kids several years back started saying, "Mom, why are you mad?" And I said, "I'm not mad, I'm thinking." But my face was pulled in and I looked angry because everything was crunched in and pulled down. One of the things that happens, of course, is that as you're concentrating and you're looking up and the wrinkles are getting deeper, you might look much more severe than you realize when you think you're looking neutral. So you don't want to look closed to communication most of the time. Obviously, there are appropriate times for doing that, but most of the time, if you're inviting interaction, if you actually want people to really be listening and to be part of the process, you don't want to seem closed down to communication. So you might need to open your facial expression a little. And one of those things, we'd call it the open face. You just slightly raise your eyebrows and relax your mouth. It would be great if you would try that now. Just relax your mouth and slightly raise your eyebrows. And that actually tends to make you look much more open to communication. It also tends to open up your voice. All of these things are connected. So it's a good thing to be looking at, just maybe resetting in between each person you have to see, right? Reset, have that moment where you take a breath, open up your face, eyebrows up just a little bit, and then start the interaction fresh. Because for this person appearing in front of you, it's often one of the few times they're going to be here, maybe the only time, even if it's something you're doing over and over and over yourself in your job. So just think about your facial expression right now. What are you conveying? Do you still have a little bit of the open face, right? Are you concentrating, looking down? How do you think that's coming across? And how can you check that and make sure that you're coming across in the way that you want to? A lot of this is getting feedback. As we've said, the best way to get better is get feedback and act on it. And so there are different ways to do that. We encourage that, and we'll talk more about that in just a little while. Another area, I mentioned what bodily orientation is, movement and bodily orientation. So you know it's like, are you turned toward or away, leaning toward, leaning back, so how your body is oriented. Body orientation and movement tend to indicate attitudes, attentiveness, comfort level, right? If somebody's fidgeting a lot, you might put some kind of meaning on that. If they're not even looking up, if they're slumped back, kind of kicked back in the chair, you're going to be looking at that as having some kind of meaning. There are some specific things that you might focus in on as a judge in terms of your own movement. Things like nodding your head, tilting your head, right? Those types of things. I've had quite a few judges say, especially when they were new to the bench, of saying how difficult it was to not nod their head all the time, and they don't want to look like they're agreeing. So they would try to. I talked to one judge in particular who said, I tried so hard not to nod, and it's what I naturally do when I'm listening. I'm kind of nodding. And she said, I know there's different kinds of nods. You can nod like you agree, right? You can nod like you're listening. Maybe you tilt the head, a little slower nod. And those look different. But remember, the participants in the courtroom might not be picking up every single cue. So she didn't want to be sitting there nodding and looking like she's agreeing, having that be the interpretation. She also said she tried so hard not to nod that she couldn't listen anymore. She had to focus so hard on it, she couldn't do anything else. So she realized, that isn't going to work either. You have to be able to listen on the bench. Finally, I asked, so what did you do if you felt like you had to nod or you couldn't actually listen? And she said, I nod at everyone. She made sure it was an equivalent behavior. Rather than when she tried to change it, it turned out to be quite difficult, ended up making sure she treated everybody equivalently and didn't just nod at one, but nodded at everybody. So that's becoming attuned to your own habits, right? Your own preferences in what you do, and maybe try to make some changes, at least understand how it's coming across to other people. I'm saying look at this both in terms of yourself and how accurate you are at interpreting it. With bodily orientation, I think I've already said that one will have a pretty big impact on if people think you are really listening to them, if you're open to listening to them. It's one of those that you can't necessarily pay attention to every one of these channels of nonverbal communication at once and do the rest of your job. It's a lot. But I think it's worth focusing in on each of these channels at some point in the day. And bodily orientation is one that once you're aware of it, is fairly easy to control, more than some of the other things. So if you notice, depending on how you're set up, where are you looking at, where's your line of sight from the bench in terms of how it's set up and where your chair is and where other people are located in the room. And just paying that little bit of attention to when you're listening to someone, to turning enough that your body is open to them, can have a massive impact. So a little bit of attention to it can make a big difference if somebody thinks they're being heard. And of course, that's one of our main elements of procedural fairness, is if they felt like they had a meaningful chance to be heard. There are, of course, quite a few other nonverbal channels, and I've talked a little bit about some of these. I'd like to just mention a few more. One of them is gestures. And in this, you may or may not have a lot of gestures when you're on the bench, but we have found that Even people who are congenitally blind, who are born blind, still gesture when they speak. So it's kind of another one of those things that's hardwired into us to gesture at least some. And so if you tie it down, right, it might actually have some impact on how well you think you communicate. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is specific gestures. And there are a couple of things you can do with your gestures that help control the room, that help open it up to communication. And I would say literally open it up, right? Open your face, open your hands, open-handed gestures, open palms. That's much more inviting than hands down, right? Which means calm down, settle down, stop, right? Very strong, some very strong gestures. Use them as appropriate. If you're trying to open it up, physically open it up with all the different nonverbal channels in addition to the words that you're using, inviting that interaction. One of the gestures I think is overused by judges is pointing. And this is one of those that's really in your face. It's an in-your-face gesture, even in the United States, but in many cultures it's considered highly disrespectful to point at someone. And yet we use this kind of all the time. And sometimes we use it for turn taking, for showing whose turn it is to speak or who we're talking to as we're talking. I think it's something that it's better not to use that gesture unless you really need it, unless you really mean it, because it's so strong. It will have more power if you don't overuse it. And then when you do need a gesture that's powerful, it's there for you. So instead, I would say you can gesture with an open hand rather than pointing. Gesture with an open hand. Again, more inviting. You're still indicating. You can still show who you're talking to or whose turn it is without doing something that's really in your face to a lot of people. So paying attention to those gestures and other aspects, your appearance, object language, I'd just like to say to describe that for you, to define it since it's another term of art. And that's really what's on or around you. So your appearance would be things like your skin color, your hair, your build, facial features, those kinds of things. And then object language is the clothes and the jewelry and maybe the stuff people can see on the bench or in your chambers. In small towns, it could even mean things like your car and your house, right? Everybody's putting meaning on things. So object language, things communicate. Things like the use of space, how much space you take up, how a room is arranged. And now you may or may not have a lot of say in how your courtroom is arranged, for instance. Things may be set in place, but you also might have more than you think. And so I've had many judges who've kind of tried to really start looking at if they have a computer on the bench, where is it, right? Does it block when they're seeing? Does it add a physical barrier? If it's to one side, does that mean now their body's almost always oriented away from the people? And how do they make sure it doesn't look like they're just talking to the folks over on this side of the room and really just looking over their shoulders at the others? So paying attention to that, there's not a perfect solution, but being aware of it can help you make sure you're trying to have the best impression, the impression you intend by what you're doing. We've also already talked a little bit about use of time, how much time you give to someone. You know, if one side gets more time than the other. Ideally, we're saying we're trying to keep things equivalent for the most part. You're not always going to have the same amount of time you need to hear from one side as the other. In that case, be transparent about it. You know, I have what I need here in the file. You know, I have reviewed it. Now what I need to know. And so you can still acknowledge that you got the information even if you're going to use more time with one side, because that's what you need to do to get the information you need to make a decision. So focus in on these different nonverbal channels and try to really figure out what's being sent through them, because they have such a big impact on the tone of the courtroom, on the perceptions of you, and on the perceptions of the process and the fairness of the process overall. A couple things just the things that might come across, either you're interpreting it in others or they might be interpreting it in you, are some signs that could be interpreted as somebody's disinterested, the disinterested listener. And so the things that would usually come on that list: lack of eye contact, excessive physical activity like fidgeting, playing with a pen, looking at a clock or a watch frequently, not responding to something that should have a response, turning away. So these are the kinds of things we want you to look at, all these different things in addition to really evaluating it when you're interpreting others' behaviors as well. So how you get better? Getting feedback on your style. There are different ways to do this. You can ask a staff member, a colleague, a trusted colleague to observe you and give you some feedback, somebody that you think could be like a coach in this way, give you constructive feedback, both what you did well and maybe some things you might want to be more aware of. I think videotape is a great tool, even if it's not particularly comfortable to watch yourself on tape. I'm in that camp right there. I still think it's incredibly useful because we all pick up habits along the way. We all have little quirks with our individual style. It's really good to get another view on that and to see how it's coming across. Audio records are good. I think even with video, it's a good idea to just turn off the sound for a little while and watch it. Focus in on your body or bodily orientation, your movement, your gestures, your eye contact, facial expressions, and then maybe some of the time just listen to the audio so that you can really focus in on your voice, on the pace, on the inflections, right? All the things that are communicating. Focus in on them at some point. Not all the time, but take enough time to really look at it and make some positive changes. I think just that self-monitoring, kind of paying attention to these different channels and actually actively doing that, actively tuning in to each of these different channels at different points during the day is a really good idea. Another thing that's important with nonverbal communication is really what we'd call the context. So the bigger situation that the communication is taking place in. And context can actually include a whole bunch of different things. It's the physical setting. It definitely includes the physical setting, but it's also the situation, what they're there for, surrounding factors like where people meet, the purpose that people are together, the relationships, the nature of the relationships, time of day even counts in here too. All these different factors can have a pretty big impact on the meanings that people are going to assign to events and to actions. And so we're going to focus in on that just a little bit more too. We have an exercise for you. On this, we have a series of slides with photos of a couple of, say, 3 or so photos that you get to focus in on and try to describe what are 3 adjectives for each context. What the kind of the surrounding factors, the physical environment, how it feels. What are the ways that you would describe these different courts, these different courthouses and courtrooms? I think it's good to go ahead and write those down. 3 adjectives per setting. So once you've done that, I want you to kind of review those descriptions. Are they positive words? Are they not? Do you think court participants, other people in addition to you, and maybe particularly people who aren't law trained, would use those same adjectives to describe it? If not, what do you think their perceptions might be? How might their perceptions of these contexts differ? Right? How imposing are some of those buildings? Right? How sterile do they feel? Does it feel like it's someplace that somebody who could come in and participate meaningfully in the court? And so from the outside in, think of your own courthouse in this way as well. What is it like when you come in? The picture we had of the courtroom where there's the barrier, there's the glass windows, right? How does that change the dynamics in the room, the feeling in the room? How does that context affect what's likely to be interpreted by all the different court participants, depending on where they are within it? These are the kinds of things that I think it's worth looking at in your own courtroom, as well as tuning into whenever you go somewhere else, how you can have an impact on it. And what it might feel like, and what you might need to do to balance it if it's not the impact you want, right? If you want something a little different, what are the things that you can do fairly easily and cheaply that would have a pretty big impact on it? Obviously, a lot of what ties right into that is communication. Your different communication behaviors can have a massive impact there. I think it's really instructive to look at the differences in the courthouse context compared to some other contexts. And so I think the main differences, some really major differences, are that there is a built-in power differential, that there are some positions, anybody with extra knowledge or the files or the power of making decisions has a bigger impact on someone's life than a lot of other contexts. In addition, there's that hierarchy, so there's a power differential between the people coming into court and the people who work there. There's also some hierarchy within the people who work there, and fairly clear hierarchy in terms of the judge and the support staff. I do think it's important that within that hierarchy you try to build in some feedback channels, some really good communication, because it makes a big difference how someone is treated by their supervisor, for instance, in terms of how then they're going to treat the people that they deal with. And so making sure that there's communication throughout all those levels and that the judge can get the feedback she or he needs, as well as all the other folks in the hierarchy. In addition, there's a very specialized language in the justice field, and it's one of those things that can make it feel very exclusive to people who don't speak the language, don't know the jargon. I know we did talk about this in Module 2 in verbal communication, about how important it is to make sure that you're using plain English, or if you have to use the terms, then to make sure you explain them if you're using legal terms. But that understanding how much kind of the intimidation factor and the exclusion factor of specialized language maybe makes that even more important in terms of nonverbal communication as well. There's often also some physical separation in the courthouse, in the courtroom, the windows, the bar, all the different things of how people are set up in the room. Those physical things impact people. And you do need to remember that if you tend to be looking straight forward and there are people on either side of you, that it's important then to do things to help overcome the physical separation. I think some physical separation's good, like there's a reason to have some of these things, but you don't want it to become a barrier to communication. And so to make sure that you turn and look at the person who maybe isn't directly in front of you is a fairly important thing to do, and understand how the physical surroundings can impact people's behavior. In addition, the courthouse context, almost always the individuals who are having to come to court have some personal issues involved, sometimes very personal. And that makes the context intimidating as well. And almost always, of course, the heightened emotions that we talked about that can almost create a psychological noise that can get in the way of the person being able to absorb the information, and which also makes it particularly important to send the same message through all the different channels that you have, so they're more likely to get the message that you want them to have. And we have a picture here of the Newark Criminal Court. And if you take a look at that, this room is used for some other purposes as well. But I want you to look at this for just a moment and see what you notice about it that might seem different than a lot of courtrooms that you've seen. Of course, one of the big things here is the photos or the pictures on the wall. There's a lot, and they're actually very inclusive. And so not that you're not a particular courtroom doesn't have to look like this, but I think it's good to raise your awareness of all the different images used throughout the courthouse and make sure they're as inclusive as possible. A lot of people from different groups will feel, they may not notice when a picture of someone from their group is included, but they're very aware when there aren't any pictures, when they are not included. People pick up on those cues quite a bit, and I think that's important to be aware of and control where you can. I'd like you to do an exercise with me now that helps demonstrate how something that feels different can actually kind of feel awkward and wrong. If you're trying to do a new behavior, you're trying to expand your communication skills and try something a little different. If you're dealing with people from different groups who might have and probably do have some pretty big differences in the way that they pause, the amount of gestures they have, how they use their voice, kind of how much they emphasize what they say, how much emotion they show. All those things can feel different to us if they're different than what we're used to. So right now what I'd like you to do is take your hands and lace them together. So you'll lace your hands together, and then take a look at which index finger is on top, which pointer finger. So lace fingers together, look at that top pointer finger. Now I want you to take them apart, shift them down one, and then lace them back together. And just think to yourself, how does that feel? How would you describe this? What I often hear from people is it feels awkward, it feels wrong. There's not a right or wrong to how we do this. It's really just what we're used to. So what I want you to do is be thinking, when I do this, now I've done it so many times that it's not uncomfortable to me, it doesn't feel awkward, it doesn't feel wrong to do something fairly different from what I'm used to. So a lot what I was used to. I was able to create a bigger comfort zone because I've tried some of the new behaviors. So I'd like you to keep that in mind, not to just feel like because it doesn't feel right to you, the pause was too long, or, you know, gee, I don't usually do that particular behavior, asking open-ended questions, whatever it might be, the verbal, nonverbal, any communication behaviors that aren't the usual to you might have that awkward feeling just because you haven't done them much. So I want to encourage you to break out of the comfort zone a little bit, expand that comfort zone. In addition, I want you to remember that every time you're dealing with somebody where you feel like it's just, you maybe feel a little bit off balance because some of the communication things are different than what you're used to. I have to be careful because I'll default back to my original preference every time. I'll kind of rest back to the way I started off doing it because it's still a little more comfortable. But it doesn't feel wrong or awkward. I can easily do it as long as I think about it. I make a conscious effort to think about it, and then I can make that change, and everybody can have a more productive communication experience from that. So as we're kind of coming around to ending this module on nonverbal communication, I want you to really think about this, to consider how the key components of procedural fairness can be promoted through these different nonverbal channels, through the nonverbal communication aspect that we've been talking about. Really take a moment to think of what specific behaviors you can do that would help impact the feeling that someone had a voice in the process, that they understood what was happening, that the people dealing with them were impartial, were trying to be fair, and finally that they were treated with respect. This is something you can revisit over and over. You can be really good at communication. You probably are to be in the position you're in, but you can still get better. There's not an end point to this. So you need to kind of come back and revisit each of these aspects whenever possible. So to kind of align some of the particular behaviors with these 4 aspects of procedural fairness, when we're talking about voice, about making sure people feel they have a voice in the process, that they've been heard enough, some of the nonverbal things you can do is when you're inviting interaction, when you want them to speak up, use that sincere tone of voice. Really pay attention to the voice. A whole bunch of respect comes through the tone of voice, in addition, of course, to the other channels, including verbal channels. But pay attention to that open voice, kind of open up your voice, open up your gestures. So open hand gestures are much more welcoming, much more likely to actually get interaction, to look like they're inviting, than, for instance, closed hand gestures. Making sure you pause long enough, maybe actually even counting to yourself after, because when we feel that time pressure behind us, a lot of times we're moving so quickly that we don't realize they are just maybe the person in this fairly intimidating context may have a need for a little more time to be able to come up with an answer or a question if they have one. Make sure you have eye contact when you're listening. It may not be at all points. If you're taking notes, for instance, and you have to look down quite a bit, I would just make sure that you explain that, right? Be transparent about it. Maybe say something about how you do need to take notes because it's important, but you're still listening. And making sure they get that message through what you're saying and how you're saying it and what you're doing as you say it. The eye contact is pretty important. Make sure you orient your body toward the speaker or toward anybody you're interacting with. That makes a huge difference, as we talked about. When we look then at the component of understanding, of making sure they felt like they understood enough what was happening so that they could be in it and be participating in a meaningful way, some things that help on understanding specific things, using a natural pace, natural inflections, Making sure you really do that, you pay particular attention to it when you are delivering routine statements, something you've said a lot. Making sure that you're not saying it just by rote and that you use a more natural cadence. Making sure you pause and make eye contact at key points to check their reactions. So the eye contact not only shows you're listening, it gives you information and helps you know if they have that enough of a level of understanding. Making sure you don't go too fast and slowing down in particular if someone seems confused or overwhelmed, giving them a little bit more space, a little bit more time. And even though I'm saying give them more time, we're not talking about a lot of time here. We're talking about a couple of beats of time. It does not need to take a lot of time to add that little extra, did you get this? In addition, for the understanding, some of these behaviors cross over, obviously, the 4 different components, and verbal and nonverbal work together. So if you're asking open-ended questions, right, you might choose your words carefully rather than just saying, do you have any questions, to check their understanding. You might say, what questions do you have? And that changes quite a bit in terms of, our default answer to do you have any questions, the easiest answer is no. But when you really want them to speak up and really ask the questions if they have them, you not only need to say it with your words, what questions do you have, for instance, but then you need to do this. Open up your gestures. Make sure you pause long enough. Right? Ask it like you're really asking a question. And so all these channels can kind of work together to add into these different components, including understanding. As far as neutrality, as feeling like the people in the court system are impartial and are trying to be fair, you can consciously use consistent behaviors with each person. So there are some things that you make sure that if you're nodding at one person, you also nod at the other, that you have a similar level of eye contact with the different people you're interacting with, that if you turn toward one, you also turn toward the other. If you're going to take notes, making sure that I've had some judges say they've noticed when they had to take a lot of notes for one side because they didn't have the information in the file. And then when the other person spoke, they didn't need to take the notes. And they felt like they could feel the inequality themselves. They could feel how it wasn't equivalent in terms of how it looked, taking notes for one side and for another. And so they've come up with their own strategies. In this, we're looking for what works for you, but the things that have worked for different people would include, some people say they still take notes, even if they don't necessarily need them for one side. Other people have said they just explain it. I've read the file, I have this information here, and then, so I don't need to take as many notes. So the explanations, the transparency. The other thing for neutrality is using that neutral but open face and really slightly raising the eyebrows and relaxing the mouth has a huge impact on how open you look to communication. And it's still a neutral look. You still look impartial, but you look like you're not shutting it down. We tend to have a more severe face than we think. We tend to look more severe as we get older, if we're under a lot of time pressure. All those different things can impact how you look to them and how open you seem, how impartial you seem. So that little bit of an open face will help quite a bit in terms of people feeling like you really are listening and still trying to be fair. The fourth component, respect, having people feel like they've been treated with respect. As I mentioned, lots of this comes through your vocal tone and your inflections. Your voice is huge in communicating respect. So really pay attention to that. Again, we're looking at eye contact, body orientation, right? Not having those confrontational gestures we talked about, open gestures as opposed to not pointing unless you really need a strong gesture, right? That's a very strong gesture, and it actually is considered disrespectful in quite a few different cultures. So using it if you need to, but not using a gesture that might seem confrontational when you don't need it. And of course, I think a lot of this is maintaining a respectful frame of mind, of keeping this idea of the need for procedural fairness in the front of your brain, in the prefrontal cortex, where you're actually actively doing things to make sure you're communicating that respect. And having that in mind to start with has a big impact on your nonverbal communication. We almost think of it as your attitudes, are almost leaked through all these different nonverbal channels. And so you have to be kind of starting with the attitude to make sure that the nonverbal communication supports it and has the impact that you want it to have. So overall, all these different small things you can do can have a huge impact on how people respond to you. This is one of the beauties of this particular area of looking at procedural fairness. We would like, obviously, to make changes across the system, and big and small, but you can start immediately. You can actually, tomorrow, you can make more of a point of really paying attention to the messages you're sending, considering if you are maybe sending unintended messages, or that it's confusing because there could be multiple interpretations. And so when you think about that, you can adapt your communication style and make sure that it works the way you want it to. I think huge is, of course, sending the same message with your nonverbals that you do with your words. They work together and are the strongest when they're congruent, when they send the same message. And finally, really sort of an overall important aspect is keeping in mind transparency and equivalence. If somebody else might have multiple interpretations of your behavior, making sure if you've been transparent about it, if you're saying why something is the way it is, perhaps why you had to start court late or whatever it might be, and then also making sure you're being equivalent to all different people. That will have the impact you want it to in terms of making some changes immediately in terms of how fair people think this process is, and of course, how that impacts their later behavior as well.